Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 51 of Humanity Rising. Every day since the 22nd of May, we've been broadcasting live worldwide on Zoom and on our Facebook page and on Awake TV and about 50 other partner channels to about 15,000 people. As we've created an open space for people literally from all over the world to come together on a daily basis to share their experiences of how they're navigating through this unprecedented pandemic, and to take counsel together as to how we can more effectively have an impact on the post-pandemic world. We've covered almost every conceivable issues in the last 50 days. Today we turn to one of the most fundamental issues that challenges every society and has done so since time immemorial, even before there was literate cultures. And that is, how do you prepare the emerging generation with the mindsets and skill sets and tool sets that they need to live productive lives, to be resilient to ever-changing challenges, and to essentially get along with one another in a cohesive, healthy, sustainable society. Whether we're talking about indigenous Stone Age cultures or modern day New York City, every parent has the same challenge of preparing their children to live in the future, characterized mostly by unknowns. So the question of education is fundamental. Those of you who've read Plato's Republic will know that Plato placed education as the number one responsibility of what he called the philosopher kings. The rulers of society ultimately have the accountability for shaping the minds, the hearts, the hands of the children. Because how children are educated shapes the future. One of the challenges that we have right now in the world is that our educational system is dysfunctional and broken in almost every conceivable way. If you think about human history over the last several thousand years, technology has changed, medicine has changed, science has changed, music, art, technology. Virtually every sector of society has changed except for education. We are still educating our young people basically the way they did in the Han Dynasty in China 2,000 years ago and in the Greek schools of Plato and Aristotle. Students come in, they have their little writing pad, they take notes from the authority figure, they memorize the information, then they take a test, and if they do really good on the test, they're given a good grade. That's what we do now at Harvard, at Oxford and Cambridge, at the University of Berlin, Moscow, Beijing, New Delhi, and Johannesburg. Students are essentially rewarded for how well they memorize information. In the last, I would say, 5, maybe 10 years, there's been an explosion of technology. The whole massive open online courses, the MOOCs, have exploded education. I still remember the event in which it started, which is worth reciting just for a moment. It was Sebastian Thrun, a great artificial intelligence expert from Germany, who was teaching in the engineering school at Stanford in November of 2011. One of his students suggested to him, "Prof, why don't you put your course online?" And he wasn't sure what that meant, but they tried it. And the next thing he knew, 169,000 people had signed up for his course in artificial intelligence from all over the world. And when they gave the test at the end, 243 of those students out there, one of which was from Mongolia, did better than his Stanford students. And he thought about it. And he realized that he would have to teach full-time at Stanford to teach as many people, those 169,000 students. He would have to teach for 245 years to cover the amount of students he just covered in his online class. He quit Stanford and founded Udacity, one of the great MOOC companies in the world today. We have the economics of change. 2/3 of the jobs that existed 10 to 15 years ago do not exist today. And 2/3 of the jobs that exist today won't exist in 10 to 15 years. That's how radically the world is changing. There was a gentleman on one of our panels in the last week that said that knowledge in the world is doubling every 12 and a half minutes. Take that in. And then think of what these poor kids are being subjected to by having to go to school, even at our elite universities, for 4 years, memorizing information, most of which was prepared 10 to 15 years ago by professors who stopped thinking. The dysfunction in education is one of the key reasons why the world is spinning out of control. Because what Einstein said is more true today than when he said it, that the consciousness that produced the problem can't solve the problem. And our educational institutions are teaching the consciousness of the past. I say this as a president of a university, Ubiquity University. We founded Ubiquity University so that we could design education from the future, not the past. This generation, and I have 2 sons, millennials, they are reaping the whirlwind. They are not ready for the world that is coming. And this pandemic is only the first of a cascade of crises that are engulfing us. So the question of how we prepare our young people, how we prepare learners of all ages with the mindsets and skill sets and tool sets that they need, not only to navigate hypercomplexity, but to somehow unleash their potential and solve the global challenges before us, is the critical issue of education. And so I'm delighted today to be able to introduce 2 colleagues of mine that are seasoned educators and dedicated as I am and Ubiquity is in their institutions to developing innovative education. May East, who is the executive director of Gaia Education, really looking at the whole phenomenon of earth-based, sustainability-based, soft skill-based education. Aftab Omer, who is an old friend and colleague. He's actually on the Ubiquity University Board of Directors. He's the founder of Meridian University, based in Petaluma, California. A very seasoned educator dedicated to integral education. And we're going to have a dialogue today about the education of the future. And so I'm delighted, Aftab and May, that you could join us. And I'll now turn the podium over to you, May, and then Aftab, and then we can talk for the next hour or so and see where we are. You're on. You need to unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much for this inspirational framing. And I would say, like Rumi, there's 1,001 ways of kneeling and kissing the earth. So there's 1,001 ways of entering to this subject. But I want to take a clue of your introductory remarks, saying, that reminding us of Einstein saying the same mindset that has created the problems cannot solve it. And I'd like to go further on that and say, do we want an education, or is the education for the 21st century beyond? Is an education to solve problems? Is an education to address the convergence of multiple crises? Or do we even need to change this perspective and say, we need an education that can unleash the potential and not solve problems? And that's a question that I'll pose to you after, because I think focusing the problems is also an old way of doing or approaching education, problem solving. What if we look at education as building the head, the heart, and the hand skills for unleashing the potential of territories, of subject matters, much more than saying, let's solve this problem?
Yeah, thank you, May, and thank you, Jim, for this occasion. So I'm aware that, and as Jim mentioned, that all three of us are educators. I know that my professional journey did not begin that way, and it was not consciously intended that way either. I ended up in this role of educator, and I'm wondering, is that true for you both as well, that it kind of ended up that way?
It's true for me.
Yeah, very true for me.
So there's something in that, in these personal and professional trajectories that brought us to education, that I'm curious about in this moment, just being with you both. It would be true to say that we are collectively in a learning crisis, not just a health crisis, not just an economic crisis. And getting our minds around what the nature of a learning crisis is, and how do we collectively show up for that? Not pretending to know when we don't know, because if we knew, then the crisis wouldn't be taking the shape that it takes. So being involved in formal higher education, I'm aware of how much emphasis, for instance, is put on learning outcomes. And 99% of the time, particularly in the US, the emphasis on learning outcomes is on intended learning outcomes, which in effect brings in a power relationship, a power differential immediately between the educator and who is being educated. The educator is holding the intended learning outcome. There's an interesting contrast between the US and Europe. In Europe, there has been much more openness to an interest in emergent learning outcomes. which puts the educator in the learning crucible. So I did not arrive today to this conversation holding this emphasis, but something about our pre-conversation, the few minutes we had together before we went live, and Jim, how you framed things to launch us, and then may your comments are just emphasizing to me, we didn't even know we're going to be educators. And now we are. And the earth itself is in a learning crisis. And here we are, earthling educators. That's what's present for me in this moment.
Yes, therefore, if we continue this line, I would say that a Leaving Earth curriculum should emerge of this learning crisis. And if the Leaving Earth curriculum emerge from a living crisis, what would be the pedagogy if we educators reposition ourselves and put ourselves in the learning process as well? And of course, we all know that we all do have adopted, and I have adopted from the very beginning, being Brazilian and having had Paulo Freire as one of my teachers at university, like for many years we've been talking, or adding the voice to the critique of the banking type of education that Jim has introduced to us, that see students devoid of any creative impetus and an empty vessel through which we know and we pour knowledge. And knowing what Yeats would say, education is about igniting the fire, not filling the empty pail. And it's like, yes, so we're not even the igniters of the fire anymore. We are there in the learning process of a Leaving Earth curriculum, and where is the pedagogy there? Is this like a place-based pedagogy? And if it's a place-based pedagogy, because it lands in a territory, can we be systems thinkers and think, okay, so if it's a place-based pedagogy and intentionally, and we can then imagine that whatever I'm learning in that place, in that territory that is relevant, because it's a Leaving Earth curriculum, if I'm learning there, I can also, my learning has an impact to the proximate whole and to the greater whole. Therefore, it is a place-based, but it's also a localized pedagogy and learning outcome.
As you're speaking, May, I'm thinking of, the term context kept coming up for me. Mm. And the degree to which attuning to context, and especially the dimension of place in terms of a awareness of earthness. This is also bringing to my mind a distinction between earth and world, that the earth itself keeps unfolding worlds. And the earth itself is at a threshold of unfolding a new world. And as educators, we know the phrase, the emperor has no clothes. There's a way in which that we as educators need to become aware of our nakedness at this threshold.
Yes. Okay, so if we are naked and we know that all around us there is an old order dying and a new one emerging, struggling to be born and find its feet, what then will be our role as naked educators? And what do we need to conserve? Because, I mean, we have a legacy for education for, hundreds of years. It's not about, reforming the whole thing. What do we need to conserve? And what is our role to let the new emerge, even though that we are naked? We need to be, are we the midwives between conserving the good, the beautiful, and the truth in education towards the emergence of the new, despite being naked? What do we need to conserve?
And how do we get beyond the idolatry of curriculum? Yes, as Wordsworth said something about, we will pass on what we have loved. And so, of course, we want to pass on what we have loved. But how that happens and what shape does curriculum take in this, at the threshold we are now at? Certainly, formal education in its formality has been an idolatry of curriculum. But I know from how we do curriculum at Ubiquity and Meridian that what keeps our institutions alive is the fact that our curriculum unfolds. And I'm wondering, May, how that has been in your work at Gaia Education. How does the curriculum stay alive, responsive, attuned to place and context?
The roots of Gaia Education are grounded in the eco-village movement. So we were 23 eco-village educators, and eco-villages, from my perspective, I see as a living learning laboratories. Is a place where we are testing many of the propositions. We are rethinking the basic relationship between humanity and the earth, and we learn a lot, lots of laboratories. I was the one living in Finhorn for nearly 2 decades, meeting with other eco-village educators that were also living in these laboratories. So in my experience, I learn much more when I make mistakes than when I do, movements that are very progressive. So we are testing many ways of teaching for 8 years, and we created a curriculum that were much more held in as a framework of life and death, of quantitative and qualitative, of dance and chant, of spirit and mathematics, was much more a framework than a curriculum with learning outcomes. And this DNA was created over 8 years, where we will be meeting and exchanging perspectives from the 3 major streams of sustainability: society, environment, and economy. So we had economists, we had educators, we had social workers, permaculturalists, but we also added a 4th dimension to this framework that we call worldview. So we went beyond the 3 major subject matters of sustainable development, and with this thinking behind that, belief systems, worldview, and they create the institutions and the world outside, which in its turn reinforces our worldview. So we cannot change the world outside if we haven't, checked our assumptions in our inner worlds. So this DNA is revised every 3-4 years, but it has only the framework and that goes to different countries. Recently, I think we have reached 55 countries, and the same kind of DNA lands in slums in South America, kibbutzim in Israel, ashrams in Thailand, in megalopolis like Sao Paulo, in cities, but it's only the major DNA or the framework. And that shapes and shifts according to what you said, the context. It is a living curriculum, and I would go further. And if we take the concept of morphic fields of Rupert Sheldrake, as much as we teach, as much as this DNA lands in different contexts, as easier it is when it lands in another place, starts already unleashing the transformative potential. And a final point is that it's not an specialist curriculum, it's a generalist curriculum. It teaches about the connections between the disciplines more than the disciplines themselves. So these are some of the roots and the characteristics of what we have been advancing with education.
I'd like to just jump in here, if I might, because I think you're asking a very important question, Aftab, about Ubiquity's approach. Our Chief Innovation Officer, Peter Mary, designed our curricular structure in an integral way. May mentioned the true, the good, and the beautiful. Another way to look at it is the I, the we, and the it. And we've done that with knowledge, what we call self-mastery, and impact. So knowledge about the world is very important for anybody learning. You need to learn about the world. But what we have emphasized are three different aspects. Number one, we want to teach the students new ideas rather than old ideas. So for example, we don't teach neoliberal economics from the Chicago school because we believe that's at the heart of the problem. We want to teach them sustainable economics, regenerative economics as an example. So I think it's very important, given the current world crisis, that the young people, when you ask May, what should we conserve? I think most of knowledge should not be conserved. I think what we have to focus in on is what's new. Secondly, and I think very importantly, memorizing information has been proven in virtually every study out there to be one of the worst forms of learning, principally because the world over, students have forgotten 80% of what they memorized within 30 days of taking the test. So there's got to be better ways to learn. And you had mentioned human potential. You know, we have not a test at the end of our courses, but creative assignments where the students are encouraged to use artistic media, all kinds of ways to express what they learned rather than memorizing information that they regurgitate. That is, in our view, fundamental. And then thirdly, and equally importantly, we believe that learning should be collaborative, not competitive. I'll never forget a friend of mine who lives in Geneva had a very bright young son wanting to be a doctor. And he went to school, the best medical school in France. And within a few months, he was morose, depressed. Finally, he was put on medication to stabilize his depression. Why? Because the professors had said to him and all the classes, 85% of you are going to flunk out by the end of the first year. We're just looking for the best. So he immediately contracted into a highly neurotic competitive student, which was against his character. He was going into the medical profession because he loved people. He wanted to heal people. So in our view, knowledge needs to be shaped in a very specific way, given the current crisis. And then, of course, the second major category is what we call self-mastery. Those are the soft skills: emotional intelligence, social intelligence. How do you develop your own personality? How do you understand the effect of nutrition and exercise, the importance of embodiment, the importance of mindfulness, the importance of innovation and entrepreneurship as mindsets rather than things that you do to kind of start a company, leadership, critical thinking. And then finally, what we call social impact. We believe that the world is burning, so it's not enough to unleash your personal potential. We all have an obligation right now to come together to solve global problems, at the center of which is runaway climate change. And in our view, the entire axis of education needs to shift from knowledge-based, without any ethics, to knowledge with ethics, which leads to action. Because all the scientists that are paying any attention are telling us we've got probably less than 10 years to turn this around. And if we don't, we may well lose the world as we know it, maybe the human race. And if we do, we're going to have to do it in a world that is disintegrating as we fix it. We're not in a stable situation anymore. And whether it's extreme weather events, whether it's the spread of epidemic diseases, whether it's the pandemic, we're now in a crescendo of crises. And our young people coming up, I mean, my two sons, this is their first real crisis, this pandemic. And they're a little confused by it, that, geez, you got to engage in social distancing. I can't go to parties without a mask. They're resentful that their world has been upended by a virus. And so how we employ the pedagogy may under current world situations is going to require, in I think my view and in Ubiquity's view, a completely new pedagogy that is not finite, but is able to shape shift as the world situation dramatically changes over in the coming years. So anyway, that's very briefly what I would say is Ubiquity's approach to learning and to pedagogy as we view the future.
I want to challenge you for one aspect, challenge in order to move the conversation. I think the urgency, we don't need to speak about that, the convergence of multiple crises, a global health crisis over climate crisis, and behind, the whole convergence of crisis. But if we kind of create a learning environment that is contextualized, it has taken the emphasis on knowledge into balancing knowledge with skills and competencies, so this we're all in agreement here. But if we use all of that for action in the world, only action, I think we won't be doing the changes that we need. First of all, I think emergency doesn't mean we need to rush. I would say no haste, but no lost movement, because we need to be, so that's the first thing. I don't think we should speed, but we need to be very conscious. And I think there's a need to balance action with reflection. Paulo Freire would say that every word contains an aspect of action and reflection. If you take the word or we can say, if we take the education and emphasize action, that action without reflection, you're just going to touch the surface of the convergence of crisis. So, and if you just emphasize reflection, then you're going to be losing yourself in rhetoric, and we should do this, we could do that. So I think action and reflection is very important. And I think for the young people, I also have 2 young girls, if you just bring this emergency aspect, it can create a restlessness that is important. Of course, it is important, but also it may not be so conducive for deep reflection. So I think the education we needs to balance action with reflection. That's basically what I want to bring. Aftab.
Aftab, what do you think?
For sure, a yes to bringing action and reflection together. And part of the challenge is because we are in an emergency, that is the existential reality, how do we still grow the capability of our action being reflective and creative while responding to the actual emergency? Both of you, May, while you were speaking about the work of Gaia Education, and Jim, while you were speaking about the work at Ubiquity University, emphasized potential. And that term surfaced in each of your statements. So there's the question about, does human potential rise to the challenge of this threshold? Can we have enough faith in our future? And if we have enough faith in our future, then that is actually faith in human potential. And that the default understanding of that would be the faith in our collective potential and in our potential as learners. Can our potential collectively as learners meet this threshold of the learning crisis? Just the way in which we are speaking, I find comforting, just to be in this kind of conversation with educators. And I'm wondering, comforting and encouraging. That's the kind of reflection we're doing. This is going to impact my work as an educator next week, or actually later today. So I'm wondering now if we might pivot. So we have about 130 people who are listening to our conversation in real time. They are also real learners, as they are, sustaining their own dialogue with each other. As I haven't looked at chat too much, but I looked at it enough while I was listening to you both to see that something is emerging there as well. And I'm wondering about us now pivoting and engaging the collective inquiry, the dialogue that is emerging.
Well, Catherine Alexander in one of the chats, I think, made a very important point that is worth noting, and that is that we need to move at the speed of change. And I think that's something that education is currently ignoring. Most of education is resisting change most of the world is asleep in a radically changing world. And it's our lack of appreciation that we need to move at the speed of change that constitutes a major part of our predicament. And so I completely would agree, for example, May, that we need deep reflection. And that's why we bring in self-mastery and the soft skills and mindfulness and embodiment, because we're very complex beings. We have multiple intelligences, and we want to devise an educational system that is honoring of all the different intelligences and nurturing all the different intelligences, spiritual intelligence, kinetic intelligence, analytic intelligence, etc., emotional intelligence. And I think that it's also the case, and I would bring in a different dimension that I think should be noted, and that is that one of the characteristics of hypercomplexity, hypercomplexity is meaning multiple complexities happening simultaneously in an integrated framework such that a small event anywhere can ricochet through the global system and have major effects everywhere, like the coronavirus. That's an example coming out of Wuhan, China, of a little virus that went global because everything is interconnected. And one of the facts that I think the world also needs to take in is not only do we have to keep pace with the speed of change, but that the only way for humanity to do that is through collective intelligence. Mm-hmm. It's now no longer possible for any one mind, even if you're Albert Einstein. Nobody can take in world knowledge that doubles every 12 and a half minutes. That's just not even possible. We don't even know what just happened. The world is doubled. World knowledge has doubled 3 times since we started this conversation. So what's necessary, just like they're putting all these computers together, that's another aspect of learning, it seems to me, is how do we start to engage in collective learning at global scales? And I don't know how one does that. I don't know how that would affect pedagogy, but it feels to me, particularly as I'm experiencing Humanity Rising, we have over 100 countries represented in the people that have, in the 7,000 people who've registered. Mm-hmm. People have been coming in from all over Africa, Latin America, North America, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, and the Far East. It's amazing where people are tuning in to Humanity Rising. How do we link all those together? And, like May, you've had incredible experience with the Global Eco Village Network. Even at Findhorn for a number of years was the epicenter of light communities all over the world, because what happened at Findhorn informed and then was informed by that network of light communities around the world. And we are experiencing that, but we haven't tapped into it, I don't believe, with the discipline and rigor that we need to in order to unleash the potential that is inherent in the collective brain. Mm-hmm.
And it's exciting to note that this initiative, Humanity Rising, that is holding this dialogue, is helping to create the enabling conditions for collaboration ecosystems. Dmitry Zaitsev says in chat, here is one problem. Almost no one is building collaboration ecosystems. And this seems to be true, that it is still rare. And here we are in the midst of the enabling conditions. And it is so exciting to think about what will emerge out of the emergence that Humanity Rising as a dialogue is about. I also want to emphasize something from Raquel Torrent about humility, a comment she makes in chat, and that how do we show up for the emergency, but show up for it with humility?
Yeah. I like to add something with what Raquel said, because I think this is a very important attribute. And the way I see humility in this conversation, Raquel, is the sense of right proportion. Because if you think that you are too big in this collaborative ecosystem, you want, because you have the brightest ideas or you come from this and that, you don't serve the system. But also, if you feel that you're too small, you also don't serve the system. So humility for me is the sense of right proportion. And that is required for all of us to be, calibrating when we enter into contributing to this collaborative ecosystem, to come with humility, which is the sense of right proportion. Too big doesn't serve, too small also does not serve, which is a design challenge for all of us.
Well, I think that's right. I think, the wise person is one who sees relationships and sees himself or herself in relationship to the whole, as opposed to the center of the whole. So I think you're making a very astute observation that humility is not, many people can interpret humility as almost a false modesty. Gandhi was humble, but he lived large. Mandela was very humble, but he lived large, because that was the proportion that history demanded of him. So that's a very, very important point.
So as a naked educator, I wonder, Aftab, if we can say that one of our revised roles would be cultivating the sense of right proportion, hope, motivation, reflection, and agency. And I see agency as a critical awareness of the context and capacity to act. Agency is very contextualized. But do you think we have any role as educator as these ones that I kind of raised? Or you think that we have to come with no tools, no intentions, how do you see this role of cultivating humility, hope, motivation, and agency?
May the term agency instantaneously brought me to the topic of democracy that we have spoken about as we were preparing for this conversation. Mm-hmm. The erosion of democracy and the erosion of agency are, in a sense, dimensions of the same process. And we have, irony is not the best word, but we'll start with that. We have the irony of neoliberal economics and neoliberal ideology, which points to democracy and the freedom of the so-called freedom of the market, suggests an agency that is that has not actualized, and even in the absence of actualizing that individual and collective agency, the ideology is sustained because of existing structures and interests. So there is a profound challenge for us as educators in terms of what is what now does it mean for us to engage education for democracy? And here, turning towards someone who even in the 90s was described as the most influential educator of that time, Paulo Freire, and to look at what Freire says when he speaks about education for critical consciousness. And what is this quality of critical consciousness? And what does it have to do with, Raquel also brought up integral consciousness in the chat. What is this critical quality of integral consciousness that can serve democracy at this time and enable us to midwife the post-neoliberal forms that, if the UN SDGs are going to find institutional traction, this kind of consciousness, this integration of reflection and action is imperative.
Well, I think it's you're making a very profound point, Aftab, that I'd like to underscore by referencing the recent op-ed in the Financial Times by Yuval Harari. Those of you who don't know him, he wrote the book Homo Deus, A Species, and then 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. To my mind, Yuval Harari is the best commentator of the current human condition out there. And I would encourage all of you to read Species and Homo Deus and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. He's a brilliant, brilliant commentator. In his op-ed in the Financial Times, written after the beginning of the pandemic, he said that the real threat of the pandemic is not around health. It's around the viability of our democracy and the rise of authoritarian systems, the increased intrusion into human privacy, the manipulation of data to enforce large-scale medical surveillance on the society. And I think, you know, Aftab, when you think about education and democracy and you look to the future, we've got to look at what does education mean in a post-privacy world? None of us have any privacy anymore. Our computers, our smartphones, all of our electronic devices are all bugged all the time. The governments are scraping that data 24/7, 365. They can access anything they want at any time, from bank statements to health records. There's no more privacy on planet Earth, particularly in the industrial societies of North America and Europe, Japan, China, certainly, and many other countries. So, you know, this question of pedagogy, this question of how do we ensure democracy, and what does democracy mean in a world with 8 billion people? Is representative democracy any longer relevant in the 21st century? How should we be educating our young people to think about governance? Is a huge, huge question. And it's particularly painfully true in the United States right now, because our president is breaking the major institutions that have undergirded the American democratic experiment: our judiciary, our legislative, and the executive branch. And so what does democracy mean, even if you take the United States, in a world of Trump? These are huge, huge issues that are well worth deep pondering. And I think this is another aspect of humility to me. For me, I completely agree it's about proportion. I also think humility is that disposition of being that lives in the questions rather than the answers. Because if you can live in the questions rather than the answers, you're always being dwarfed by that which you do not know.
I'm thinking, Jim, your last comment evoked this idea. Should we ask everyone who's listening and could potentially contribute, should we ask a question that goes something like this? At this threshold, it is clear that the competencies, the capabilities we have individually and collectively are insufficient. So if we're going to cross this particular crevasse, it will be through the actualizing, through the unfolding of potentials that we are, but are not actualized yet. And to gather the collective intelligence in this moment of what comes to people's mind when they imagine what is that competency individually and or collectively that we have potentially but needs to be actualized. What shows up as the top for them, and see what the swarm is doing right now. Can we invite that into chat from as many people as are willing?
That's a great question, everyone.
I could do a cloud with all these terms.
If you had to name the number one competency needed right now, what would it be? We'd love to hear. Give us 5 minutes to reflect, please. Yeah, but that's love, curiosity, connecting communities, critical thinking, psychology of change, love, collaboration, integration, cooperation. We're interdimensional beings, empathy, to explore indigenous wisdom, self-awareness, understanding that knowledge, you're going too fast now. This is amazing. Embrace risk and trust, compassion, connection to spirit and love, spiritual connection, open-heartedness, competence, listening with intent to understand, not to solve. Yes, absolutely. Listening and collaboration, compassion again. Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves. Yes. Importance of the individual connected to the web of everyone.
17 hours.
Education of the here mind, heart mind. Enter the natural world, heart, humility, love of learning. Human beings have divine souls. Understanding why we are even on this crazy planet. Being one in consciousness, ability to redesign ourselves, evolution of consciousness, surrender, collective sense-making. David Bohm, breathing in creative love, holding space for and sensing the synchronicities emerging. Awareness is consciousness. Deep listening to answers, mindful parenting, absolutely, boy. Surrendering to our greatest fulfillment, active listening, separation within. There is only one of us here. So true. Limitless love and compassion. Cardiosynthesis. Now there's a good one. Awareness of being here to serve rather than to conquer. curiosity for change and transformation, courage to be ourselves, understanding and letting go of ego, reconsider our first teacher, finding oneself, unconditional love, attunement, and listening beyond the known. This is amazing, the gift of giving. This is a great question, off top. Coherent brain, heart, and gut. Absolutely, boy. Good creating co-creating a structure to put these all together, cultivating trust. That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
That's actually a gift for all of us, a gift of collective thinking. As I was
this is
listening,
the collective mind.
I was thinking, I had this image of a necklace with all beads with all this thinking ideas together in one, in the field that we have created in this exploration of education for the 21st century.
Yeah. Maybe it would be nice for each of us to comment on the list and to add what we think if we had to pick one competence. That's a challenging question if you had to pick one, because they're so cluster. But off top, since you asked it, why don't you answer, and then May, and then I'll give it a shot, and then we can move on or wrap up depending on the energy. Off top?
Jim, what leaped to mind was the phrase learning together. Learning together, collective learning. When you brought May and I into contact a couple of months ago, for the sake of this dialogue, our conversations became a way of learning together. And then when the three of us spoke right before the going live, again, it had that quality of inquiring and learning together. And that's been the quality of this conversation. Real-time learning. Nothing packaged, totally fresh from the garden of the eco-village. So over to you, May.
Well, the one that resonates a lot was somebody who said cardiosynthesis, because it's a new concept, and I'm always thinking that we need a new lexicon to name the reality that we are the growing edges of our times. And this brought to me my bead to this necklace, that if I had a bead, if I could say, was the concept, or is the concept of complexity, which is something that I discovered as I decelerated over the lockdown here in UK. And everything was very, very slow. And I remember some of the ancient ones of my country would say that on the threshold time, when we're in a threshold, we have this eagerness to go very quick to the next cycle. And I learned since very young age, they'll say to me, May, go slowly as you are passing through one cycle to another cycle in your life, because that's where you have all your lessons. They'll say in the threshold leaves the lizards, and the lizards are like the dragons. If you don't pay attention to the lizards, and if you go very quick, and then the whole next cycle, you may need to repeat the experience until you learn the lessons of the threshold. And during this threshold time, I had this cardiosynthesis happening inside of me, but also I had this thought about this so complex. The only way through, the medicine through which going through, was to simplify within the complexity. And I start waking up and trying to embody complexity as I am moving. I'm still on the threshold. We're still on the threshold. So as I move through the threshold, I'm moving with cardiosynthesis and sympaxity.
Wow. Well, you know, I think I would agree with you, May. I think the cardiosynthesis, I'm not sure what it all means, but I think that, you know, our civilization has been dedicated to the brain for about 2,000 years, and look where it got us, especially since the Enlightenment. It's all been about rationality, logic, analytical thinking, left brain worldview. And I think one of the most consistent themes, by the way, that has been coming up over and over and over again in the Humanity Rising sessions over the last 51 days has been the heart and love and heart coherence and listening to the heart. And I think that's where I would come down. I think if I had to pick one, since you're forcing us off top, as any good professor should do from time to time, if I had to pick one competence, I would say it's learning heart coherence. It's learning the experience of cardiosynthesis, because I think that when we go to our heart, we're going to the center of our being. And the heart is sending far more signals to the brain than the brain is sending to the heart. And the heart is sending far more signals down to the gut than the gut is sending to the heart. The heart, as the ancients understood, the ancient Jewish tradition, for example, the Egyptian tradition, other ancient traditions, the heart was always considered the center of the consciousness. It was only in the West that we developed this notion that somehow it was in the brain. And so that's a relatively new notion, and it's gotten us into a lot of trouble. And so we've had some brilliant lectures on heart coherence in the course of Humanity Rising. And so that's where I would come down, is just to start listening to your heart. And I've taken it up as a practice every day in, day out, spending time just listening to your own heartbeat. If you have to put your hand over your heart, just quiet yourself and just listen to your own heartbeat with a smile on your face, just with gratitude that you're alive. And if you just do that for even 3 minutes a day, according to the scientific data, you release over 1,400 different chemicals and hormones in your body, all of which do really good things for your immune system, for your stress levels, for your body equilibrium, your hormonal balance, your pineal gland, your pituitary gland, just by listening to your heart. And it's coming out of the heart that compassion flows. Coming out of the heart that empathy and many of the competencies that were listed all naturally derive by just simply spending time every day listening to your heartbeat.
I'm wondering, Jim and May, if we could take about 3 minutes just to do what you described, actually do that and invite others to do that with us for about 3 minutes. And then each of us could make a closing statement.
Perfect.
And maybe we also give people a minute to copy. I know I want to copy this chat
Yes.
and learn from it. And just to give everybody an opportunity to copy it and have the richness of our harvest. So Jim,
the chat is being saved, and I can save it now and put it to download for you guys.
Oh, thank you, Georg. So
Beautiful.
Jim, will
Thank you,
you
Gary.
guide us in this?
Okay, and by the way, as Avon Madison is pointing out, this is really the heart math quick coherence technique, and it's very, very simple. Just sit or just be comfortable, close your eyes. And if it helps, put your hands over your heart. It's just some way where you can, if you're not used to listening to your heart, so that you can try to just put your awareness in the center of your chest. Try to find your heart. And for the next 3 minutes, 180 seconds, just as best you can, just be aware of your heartbeat. And if you can engender a emotion of gratitude and appreciation and love as you listen to your heartbeat, that's one of the healthiest things you can ever learn to do, starting now. Thank you, everyone. And now we'll make some final statements of our own. And I would love again for all of you to just write anything you would love to write in the chat box. This is very precious what's happening today. This is a highly interactive experience in group mind. And so you write what you've got in the chats, and then May, do you want to start? And then I can say something, and then Aftab, then you can have a final word. Then we'll close out the session.
Yeah, so if I was about to write in the chat what I felt was that listening to the heart should be part of the pedagogy of the 21st century education. So that would be my contribution to the chat. Aftab?
So this conversation became more than interesting, more than exciting. It became beautiful. And somehow the conversation found its heart. And so perhaps we can say that the heart we are invoking is the heart that perceives beauty. And somehow we fell into its guidance. I would like people to know that none of what happened, essentially nothing that happened in this conversation, was planned by the three of us. We had our conversations before, and we were preparing. So thank you to you both, May and Jim, and to everyone else who gave their heart to this time together. Jim.
Yes, thank you. I've been just noting everything in the chats. I just want to, first of all, thank all of you participating in this chat. It's so interactive day in and day out. It's just a wonderful, wonderful energy that you all are bringing to session after session. And I just want to acknowledge all of you. I would also just say that when Roland McCarty, who's the director of research at the HeartMath Institute, lectured several weeks ago, he pointed out that when you come into heart resonance in your body and your heart becomes resonant and coherent, the reason why it's becoming coherent is because it's starting to sync with the resonance of the electromagnetic pulsations of the earth. And that when a large group of people come together in heart coherence, they begin to beat together. It's really quite extraordinary that not only when you come into heart coherence, as we were doing right now in that 3 minutes, no matter where you were in the world, it doesn't matter. You can be as far away as China to Brazil or Canada to India. When two people with intention come together in heart coherence, time and space doesn't matter. It's really an extraordinary phenomenon. And so what we're doing, and it seems very, very simple, but the reason why you become coherent is you become connected with all that there is. And by the way, one of our partners is the Global Pulse initiative. And every month they have a meditation, which is going to be on the 18th of July. And Ubiquity University actually is hosting the one. Humanity Rising and Ubiquity we're co-hosting the session on the 18th of July. We'll announce it. And that's when hundreds, if not thousands of people from all over the world spend about an hour together just experiencing heart coherence. It's one of the most extraordinary experiences you'll ever have. And I could not agree more May, with your notion that not only, I would say, I would take it a step further. I would say not only should it be part of the curriculum of any 21st century education, it should be at the heart of the curriculum. Can you imagine? It's like what the Dalai Lama said. He said, if we would teach everybody mindfulness in the schools, we would have peace on earth in a generation. Mm. Just think of from kindergarten on, every child was taught heart coherence so that people could sit every day for 5-10 minutes. And if you can sit in heart coherence, Joe Dispenza, by the way, has done remarkable research, hooking people up to, EEGs and all kinds of brain scans. And when you can hold your heart coherence, not for 3 to 5 to 10, but for 30 and 40 minutes, you can heal your body of almost anything. And I would urge you to spend some time on the Heart Math Institute website and Heart Ambassadors, Sheva Carr and Robert Browning of the Heart Ambassadors. You can become a Heart Ambassador where you actually learn it and you can teach it. And then Joe Dispenza teaches heart and brain coherence in a way that is experiencing dramatic healing of major diseases by the hundreds among people that are going to his sessions. So this stuff really works and needs to be at the heart of education as we know it. So this is a beautiful place with which to end our session today. I will thank you, Aftab and May. This has turned out to be splendid and so very heartful. And I really appreciate your presence and your leadership and the spontaneity of this discussion. So we'll see you same time, same station tomorrow, everyone, between 5 o'clock and 7 o'clock p.m. Central European Time for day 52 of Humanity Rising. Bye.